January 26th, 2026. 4:57 p.m. Eastern Time. End of the business day. Donald Trump is watching Korean markets prepare to open in just a few hours. He picks up his phone, one post on Truth Social, 10 words that change everything. And in less than 48 hours, America's closest allies just executed the largest coordinated economic strike against US influence since World War II. This isn't about tariffs. This is about the moment the global order fractured. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, minute by minute, dollar by dollar. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why 3 separate powers just built a trading system that completely bypasses American control. Hit subscribe right now because what you're about to learn isn't making headlines anywhere, but it should be. Here's what nobody's talking about. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appeared on ABC News just days before this. He said something that should have made every American pay attention. We have put 25% tariffs on India for buying Russian oil. Guess what happened last week? The Europeans signed a trade deal with India. That wasn't analysis. That was a warning shot, and nobody listened. January 26th, late afternoon, Trump posts his threat to South Korea. He's raising tariffs from 15% to 25% because Seoul's legislature hasn't approved their $350 billion investment deal fast enough. The post drops at 5 p.m. Eastern, just as markets are closing in New York. But in Seoul, it's already morning. Korean markets are about to open. South Korean automaker stocks drop immediately. Hyundai and Kia shares fall as much as 6% in early trading. Emergency cabinet meetings. Trade ministers scrambling. Seoul sends delegations rushing to Washington. But here's where it gets interesting. While South Korea scrambles to respond, something else is happening 9,000 miles away in New Delhi. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi are finalizing documents. Less than 48 hours after Trump's threat, they announce what von der Leyen calls the mother of all deals, a free trade agreement creating a 2 billion person economic zone. Combined GDP, $27 trillion. That's 25% of humanity and 25% of global economic output. Now pause for a second. The India-EU trade talks started in 2007. They stalled in 2013. They relaunched in 2022. But in the 48 hours after Trump threatened South Korea, they finalized everything. You think that timing is random? Keep watching. Let me show you what actually happened. South Korea's $350 billion commitment to the United States equals 11% of their entire GDP. Think about that. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after World War II, cost $150 billion in today's dollars. Korea is being asked to pay more than double that just to avoid tariffs. Here's what tells you everything. After Trump's threat, Korean automaker stocks crater. Hyundai and Kia drop as much as 6% in early trading, but by market close, they've recovered most of those losses, finishing down only around 1%. The market barely flinched. Trump threatens massive tariffs, and Korean markets barely flinch by close. What does that tell you? Global markets are betting against Trump's leverage. They think Korea has options. Now watch the timeline. January 20th, Trump issues ultimatums about Greenland. Europe knows he invaded Venezuela on January 3rd. They know he's serious about using force. Days before, Bessent goes on national television warning about the India-EU deal. January 26th, Trump hits Korea with the tariff threat. January 27th, Europe finalizes the India deal to show they have options. This is called a flanking maneuver, and it worked perfectly. But there's another layer most people are missing. Russia and India have dramatically expanded their energy relationship over the past few years. India now imports over 1/3 of its crude oil from Russia. That's up from nearly zero before the Ukraine war. Russia sells oil to India at massive discounts because Western sanctions cut them off from European markets. India refines Russian crude oil and sells refined products back to Europe. Europe gets Russian energy without technically violating sanctions. Russia needs customers. India needs cheap energy. Europe needs energy that's not directly from Russia. All three win. The United States loses control of the flow. The US imposed those tariffs to isolate Russia. Instead, America created a multi-billion-dollar annual system that completely bypasses US oversight. India has been buying Russian weapons for decades. Over half their military equipment comes from Moscow. And the EU-India deal includes a security partnership that could give Brussels access to that same market. While Trump fights over percentages, three powers just built economic infrastructure that functions without dollars, without US approval, generating billions annually that Washington can't touch. If you're starting to realize this isn't a routine trade spat, hit that like button right now. We just watched Europe and India construct a $27 trillion trading bloc while Treasury Secretary Bessent was trying to warn about exactly this scenario. And it happened anyway. Comment below. How long do you think American leverage survives this? Let's talk about who actually wins and loses here. Start with China. While America fights with its own allies, Beijing just sits back and watches. They're not intervening, they're just watching the Western alliance tear itself apart from the inside. What did China gain without lifting a finger? South Korea's #1 export destination is China. They've been increasing semiconductor imports from Korea substantially. While Trump threatens Seoul, Korea quietly maintains and grows shipments to Beijing. The India-EU deal creates a massive trading zone that operates in euros and rupees. That reduces dollar demand, exactly what China wants for yuan internationalization. Yuan-denominated trade has grown significantly over the past few years. BRICS expanded from 5 to 11 countries, with over a dozen more applying. Combined GDP, over $28 trillion, larger than the US economy. China's playing a 10-year game, America is playing a 10-day game. Now, who got crushed? The United States. What America lost in these 48 hours is massive. The automatic assumption that allies need US approval for major trade deals, the ability to use tariffs without consequences. The perception that dollar alternatives are just theoretical, here's the cascade effect. Countries start bypassing the dollar for trade. They don't need as many dollar reserves. They sell US Treasury bonds. Bond prices drop, US borrowing costs rise, that $36 trillion national debt becomes more expensive to service. The dollar was over 70% of global reserves in 1999. Today, it's down to around 58%. At the current rate of decline, we could hit below 50% within a few years. That's the tipping point. When the dollar falls below half of global reserves, the entire system changes. US sanctions work because they cut countries off from dollar-based systems. But if you're operating outside the dollar system, sanctions become suggestions. Russia has increased trade with China by over a third after sanctions. Iran sells oil in yuan. Venezuela pays China in crude. The sanctions weapon is dulling in real time. But here's who you didn't expect to win: India. Prime Minister Modi is running the perfect hedge strategy. Buying Russian oil at heavy discounts, refining it, selling to Europe at premiums, taking US security cooperation while buying Russian weapons, signing mega deals with Europe while maintaining BRICS membership. India's foreign reserves have grown substantially in recent years, among the fastest growth rates globally. Foreign direct investment up significantly. Manufacturing shifting from China, increasing by double digits. Modi has been signing major trade deals consistently. India is playing both sides. And it's working brilliantly. Who's getting crushed in all this? South Korea. Seoul is trapped between two superpowers. They need US military protection against North Korea, but their economy depends on China, which takes about a quarter of all Korean exports. After Trump's threat, Korean stocks recovered their losses by the end of day. Markets aren't taking the threat as seriously as Trump wants. When the stock market shrugs off your ultimatum, you're losing credibility. President Lee can't convince his own legislature that the deal must pass immediately. Korea is trying to play the middle, but the middle is disappearing. Let me show you the pattern you need to understand. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window without warning allies. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. Europe's response eventually became the euro. 2003, Bush invaded Iraq over European objections. The transatlantic relationship fractured. 2017 to 2020, Trump's first term. He pulled out of the Iran deal, the Paris Climate Accord, and threatened NATO. Europe started building what they call strategic autonomy frameworks. 2026, Venezuela invasion on January 3rd. Greenland threats on January 20th. Korea escalation on January 26th. EU-India response within 48 hours. Each iteration happens faster. Each rupture goes deeper. The numbers tell the story. Dollar's reserve currency share in 2000, over 70%. Today, around 58%. That's a significant drop over just over 2 decades. If the trend continues, we're looking at fundamental system change within years. Here are 3 scenarios for what happens next. Scenario 1, slow decline. The British pound took 30 years to go from reserve currency to regional player. The dollar follows the same path. By the mid-2030s, important but not dominant. Your savings lose 20 to 30% of purchasing power over time. Scenario 2, sudden rupture, like Nixon closing the gold window over a weekend. Trigger events could include Saudi Arabia announcing yuan oil sales, China making major treasury moves, or a significant conflict. Timeline? Could be months to a couple years. Retirement accounts could lose substantial purchasing power. Scenario 3, managed transition. Major powers negotiate a controlled handoff. Problem is, this requires cooperation when everyone's fighting, least likely given current trajectory. We're currently on Scenario 1 with the risk of triggering Scenario 2. What does this mean for your life? If the dollar loses reserve status, inflation could spike. When the pound lost status, Britain experienced significant inflation. Your grocery bills increase. Your monthly expenses jump considerably. Interest rates could surge. The US borrows at relatively low rates because of dollar demand. Without that privilege, rates could potentially double. Your mortgage payment could increase by hundreds or even over $1,000 a month. That's thousands more per year. Here's the bitter irony. The policies meant to preserve American dominance may be accelerating its loss. Tariffs push countries to explore alternatives with China. Sanctions force the development of parallel systems. Aggressive rhetoric makes allies hedge their bets. It's potentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more pressure applied, the faster alternatives develop. So what happens next? South Korea's National Assembly is debating right now. They said they'll pass the investment package by end of February. But Trump's threat didn't speed anything up. It might have slowed things down due to nationalist concerns. If Trump actually implements the 25% tariffs before February ends, Korea's legislature might reject the deal entirely, out of principle. In February 2026, G7 finance ministers meet in France. Watch what they say. If it ends with coordinated statements, that's one path. If it's vague language and separate deals, G7 coordination is weakening. By April, South Korea either ratifies under pressure or finds a face-saving delay. Most likely, they ratify with conditions that give Seoul flexibility. By June, the India-EU agreement will be moving through legal review. European Parliament debates begin. If it passes easily, European unity is solid. If it struggles, divisions remain. A new equilibrium is forming. Two-track system. Track 1, US-dominated security architecture. NATO, AUKUS, the Quad. Track 2, non-US economic architecture. EU, India, ASEAN, BRICS convergence. Countries stay on track 1 for military protection. Track 2 for economic stability. That's not a traditional alliance. That's a transactional relationship. Wild cards that could change everything. China moves on Taiwan. Everything changes overnight. Trade deals become less relevant. We shift to different priorities entirely. The European far right wins major elections in 2026. If Le Pen wins France or AfD gains power in Germany, EU strategy could shift dramatically. The India deal might face challenges. Supreme Court rules on Trump's tariff authority. There's a case pending on presidential power. If the court limits that authority, the entire strategy shifts. BRICS announces a functional alternative to SWIFT banking. If that becomes operational, the financial infrastructure supporting current systems changes. Sanctions become harder to enforce. Let me bring this together. We started with a late afternoon social media post on January 26th. What looked like another tariff threat was actually a critical moment when America's allies stopped waiting for permission. This is part of a multi-year pattern of evolving global economic dynamics. We're well into this transition. The breaking point could come when the dollar drops below 50% of reserves or when oil gets priced in multiple currencies as standard practice. The current trajectory suggests major shifts potentially in the next few years. Your life changes when inflation increases, interest rates rise, and purchasing power declines. These transitions don't happen overnight. They happen gradually over years. We're watching it unfold. And South Korea's stock market recovered after Trump's threat. Markets aren't responding the way Trump wants. That's not my opinion, that's market data. And markets respond to underlying realities. If this changed how you see global trade dynamics, hit that subscribe button right now. We just watched America's allies build a $27 trillion trading bloc within 48 hours of a tariff threat. That's not random timing. That's a strategic response. Drop a comment. Which scenario do you think plays out? Slow decline, sudden rupture, or managed transition? Will South Korea ratify by February? Who benefits most from all this? China, India, or Europe? Share this with someone who needs to understand how global power actually shifts. Here's what we're tracking next. Korea's National Assembly debate. The G7 finance ministers meeting in February, whether Trump escalates or negotiates. Remember, this isn't partisan analysis. This is about understanding how economic power actually works in the real world. The dollar became the global reserve currency because of specific decisions made in 1944 at Bretton Woods, maintained through petrodollar agreements in the 1970s, supported through global presence. Those foundations are evolving right now, not by vote, by market forces, strategic positioning, and changing power dynamics. You can't stop major trends by ignoring them. You can only understand and prepare. And preparation starts with information. Subscribe if you want to track how this unfolds. This is the geopolitical reality. This is how power actually shifts. And now you understand the pattern. Watch another video here to stay ahead of what's coming next.